Welcome back. Now, South Africa's formal sector employment decreased by 0.8% in the second quarter. According to data released by Stats SA, the total number of people employed in the formal sector, excluding agriculture, stood at 10.5 million in the April to June period. Development economist at Stellenbosch Business School, Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, joins us now for an assessment of the print. Nthabiseng, thanks so much for your time today. Now, every other quarter, we get really sobering numbers that remind us that the country is indeed in a jobs crisis. Nothing surprising, but a reminder, I guess, that real structural reforms, real economic growth is needed to create jobs in the country, right?
Absolutely. Greetings and thanks so much for having me. I think the continuation of formal employment job losses, we're really in a jobs bloodbath, if I can call it that. Continual decline in employment across where you ordinarily have seen increase in employment, particularly in trade and manufacturing, in community services. And these are the labor-absorptive sectors. And so where you're feeling now the strain and the decline is where ordinarily in tertiary services, where we have seen an expansion. Business services have declined, transport has declined, construction has declined, as has manufacturing. And this continued decline simply means that total employment and formal employment has declined by over 229,000 jobs. So we are shedding jobs year on year, and quarterly we are shedding jobs. And so what this points to is what we've always been saying, is that the labor-absorptive sectors in the economy need to find more focus, and the labor-absorptive jobs, they come from sectors which are now shedding jobs year on year continually, and in the formal space especially, and this is very concerning.
And let's get sector specific for a bit. What makes the print even more relevant is that over the past months we've been hearing of many companies from the formal sector announcing job cuts, AMSA winding down some of its plants, resulting in over 3,000 job losses, Goodyear's plant closure affecting about 900 people, and that also speaking to the data, right, as the manufacturing sector, one of those sectors shedding the most jobs. It also makes me think of the wave of deindustrialization we've been seeing in SA.
Absolutely. So what you're talking about is the non-agricultural formal sector. So we know that that is the proponent or the sector, and the share of employment largely comes from these subsectors that are in the non-agricultural formal sector. We also know in particular it's sitting at 10.5 million, which is nowhere near where we need it to be in South Africa. And so the first point you've mentioned is the deindustrialization. This is a summary of the growth path of South Africa from the 60s, 80s, particularly post-1994. If you look at the trend of economic growth and expansion, we have been deindustrializing. At the turn of democracy, we were sitting at around 22% of contribution of manufacturing sector as a whole in totality to GDP. We are now sitting at around 14, 13% year on year. This changes depending on which annual year you're looking at. But what it's basically saying is that manufacturing, because of competition from outside South Africa, because of trade policy, and also because of inhibiting factors within manufacturing, the cost of inputs, whether it's electricity, whether you look at inputs that we import, whether it's the currency, because a lot of goods that you import into South Africa go into the production value chain in the different subsectors, and the cost of these is derived primarily from the strength of the rand. And so you see that manufacturing is under severe strain, and yet this is where we need to put emphasis in terms of how do we unlock manufacturing, but also construction, but also some of the subsectors that are labor absorptive within the primary sector. We're seeing a continuation of that strain in manufacturing. And I think the industrial policy action plans 1 and 2 and various other plethora of plans that have been put in place are not yielding sufficient momentum and expansion. So we need to relook at what tools do we employ and instruments to employ so that we can start to see those subsectors expanding.
I mean, you talk to, representatives from the private sector, and many will tell you that, yes, there are master plans in place, but they are struggling with implementation. Now, Nthabiseng, the last time we had a conversation, you even mentioned it at the top, we spoke about how the market doesn't have the capacity to absorb the additional individuals that come into the labor force, and speaking on the importance of government being deliberate and, having a plan or strategy that deals with these dynamics. Just recently, with the jobs bloodbath, Labour Minister Nomakhosazana Meth urged companies in need of support to reach out to her department for assistance. We've also heard from Minister Dow, Minister Steenhuisen, also working together to mitigate job losses as companies have been hit by those U.S. tariffs. Just walk me through, what you've made of some of the approaches and some of, the plans that have been out from government recently.
So the first thing you need to do is, at least there's an admission that what we're doing is not yielding fruit, and therefore interventions need to be put in place. But I think the urgency of those interventions, and I think the scale of the interventions doesn't follow the problem and the size of the problem. So the first thing, I think one of the efforts government is putting in place, on Friday there will be what we call the Transformation Fund that is launched to primarily target an entry of excluded businesses into the mainstream economy. The first thing government needs to do is very deliberately make a decision on how is the financial sector going to boost and bolster expansion and production. This is something that has been at the forefront of why South Africa hasn't seen expansion. In addition to, of course, the issues around enabling environment, you've got to have a financial ecosystem that enables growth, private sector credit extension avail to SMMEs and small businesses. So the first thing is that you've got to agree, I think, collaboratively as the different departments, the different subsectors, that something has to be done deliberately. You have to integrate the efforts. So you can't have one ministry doing something that another ministry is not aligned to, so that we can mainstream and remove blockages, whether it's regulations, whether it's approvals. And we fast track these for businesses, for companies, large and small, but also create a financial ecosystem that is very deliberately targeting enterprises, SMMEs, and the excluded, particularly black business and black industries in the rural areas, in township communities, and in the labor-absorptive subsectors, using the state. We had the similar problem in the 60s and the 50s where Afrikaners were not able to be absorbed, and it was the state that had to intervene. Why? Because the private sector may not have the capabilities because of their own profit-seeking objective. And so you need to look at what is for the public good. And that's where the state must intervene with very deliberate and very big interventions that enable us to deal with the conundrum of, number one, discouraged work seekers, which are more than 3 million, and they keep expanding. And number two, the unemployed, low-skilled youth who have never worked, and that is a structural problem because they don't have experience. And so your public works, your public employment programs, they have to be massified at scale, but also you need to make sure that you create businesses that are able to employ at large in multiplication if they're enabled to enter into the mainstream. And I think this requires coordination from the state. I think the president, similarly to what was done in COVID with the COVID Council, you need an economic council where you collaborate business, labor, and all the entities of the state that are seen as agencies that can collaborate together with the state to address this unemployment crisis. It cannot be allowed to continue without a very deliberate, organized, and very integrated fashion. Otherwise, we won't see the gains and the results that we need to see at the speed which we need to see them happening.
And just on those interventions and making sure we fast track these plans, I just like your analysis on, how government is also just dealing with economic redress, particularly when it comes to labor reform. We have two of the biggest parties in the GNU at odds about key legislation, that being BEE as well as the Employment Equity Act. Just last week, Busa made headlines for challenging employment equity quotas. And, you mentioned this is a collaborative effort. And I wonder whether we'll be stuck if all these parties, these stakeholders, don't agree on key legislation?
So what is important here is for us to understand from an evidence-based perspective, inequality is bad for growth. It's been proven categorically so globally across the globe, and inequality in South Africa is primarily race-based. We know this because it's our history that has excluded majority black people from either participating in the economy or participating in ownership of key sectors of the economy. Now, what redress requires so that you deal with inequality, Gini inequality in terms of income inequality, we know we have the worst inequality globally, whether it's the share of income in the top 5, 10% versus the bottom 40%. But also we're seeing an inequality that is quite astounding across businesses, where we're finding that the concentration of businesses, let's say in manufacturing and construction, in plastics industry, chemicals, even in renewables and new subsectors, big business has a huge share. 3 or 4 companies have more than 70% of the turnover in some of these subsectors, retail, across trade, and so forth. A lot of this has already been researched, and you can go and look at the surveys and the studies that have been done using Stats SA data by primarily the Competition Commission. Now, what this says is that inequality is part and parcel of the reason why South Africa is not able to grow. We have to spread and redistribute the gains of wealth, the gains of growth, to more than 3 or 4 entities within retail, within trade, within manufacturing, within business services, even within the financial ecosystems. That is why it's good to have new entrants. What I would love to see from those proponents who are saying we mustn't ensure spreading of the wealth, redistribution of the wealth as a matter of structural reform, because it was there because of the inequalities put in place by apartheid and the legislation of apartheid. If we can hear what the solutions are to deliberately intervene and make sure that equity and gains from profit and wealth are distributed, right? And there are tools and instruments that are legislated, and it's not something that you do if you would like or as a compliance mean, but because you need to do this if you actually want to grow economies. So I think I haven't heard those suggestions. What I do hear is more rebuttals of why we cannot have certain legislation around BE and employment equity. My suggestion would be, let's improve the tools. Let's not do away with the tools, because redress is a function of our history. We need redress. We must have redress, because that is why we are also not growing. Beyond the structural inequalities and structural constraints in some of the enabling things like the cost of electricity or the cost of moving goods and services, the issue of excluding the majority of people in the South African economy from production and participating in the economy and ownership of subsectors in the economy is a serious hindrance for us to growing this economy.
All right, let's leave it there. Nthabiseng, thanks so much for your time and just taking us through some of the dynamics playing out in the labor market. Now, that was Nthabiseng Moleko, development economist at the